400 years of galactic conquest, the Varathi Empire has never lost a war. I know this because I have been part of that legacy for most of my career. My name is Ven Solari, and on the day everything changed, I was standing in the grand diplomatic chamber of Neutral Station Oreth 9, holding a tablet that carried the Emperor's holographic seal and a formal declaration of annihilation against a species called humanity. 12 of our warships were visible through the viewport behind me, their hulls gleaming like polished bone against the cold black of space. My aide, Dreneth, stood at my left shoulder, with his hands clasped behind his back and his face arranged in the expression of rigid professionalism that I had come to depend on over the years. 2 armed sentinels flanked the entrance, their pulse rifles charged and ready, though I could not imagine a scenario in which we would need them. Everything was prepared, everything was perfect, and then the human walked in, carrying a thermos and a leather bag, and nothing was ever perfect again. Her name was Catherine Hale. She was the only envoy humanity sent. I want you to understand how unusual that was. When the Keth Dominion received their declaration, they sent 47 representatives, each one weeping before the first clause had been read aloud. The Ilari Consortium dispatched their entire senior council, 200 beings in ceremonial mourning dress, their bodies already painted in the ash-gray pigment that their culture reserved for the acceptance of death. Humanity sent one woman. She had no entourage, no military escort, no diplomatic corps trailing behind her in formal attire. Just one middle-aged woman in a plain gray suit, walking at a pace that suggested she was in no particular hurry to be anywhere. Her hair was brown, cut short, practical. Her shoes made soft sounds on the polished floor of the chamber. She sat down across from me, set her thermos on the table between us, placed her leather bag on the chair beside her, and smiled. Not a nervous smile, not a brave smile, the kind of smile you give a waiter when you sit down at a restaurant and you already know what you want to order. I cleared my throat and activated the tablet. The Emperor's seal flared to life above it, a holographic projection of golden light that filled the space between us with the sigil of Varathi Dominion. I had delivered declarations like this 11 times before. I knew the rhythm of the words, the weight of each clause, the precise moment when the reality of what was being said would break through whatever composure the receiving species had managed to assemble. I had watched that moment happen 11 times, and it always looked the same. The eyes went wide first. Then the hands began to tremble. Then the voice, if they tried to speak, cracked like thin ice. I read the terms aloud. Unconditional surrender of Earth and all 17 colony territories. Complete disarmament within 30 standard solar cycles. Tribute payments in perpetuity, calculated at 12% of gross planetary output. Forced integration into the Empire's labor framework, with human populations reassigned to production sectors based on aptitude assessments conducted by Varathi administrators. Dissolution of all independent human governing bodies, effective immediately upon ratification. Permanent military occupation of all human-held systems. Prohibition of independent scientific research without imperial oversight and approval. I delivered every clause with the gravity it deserved. I made sure my voice carried the full weight of 400 years of unbroken dominion. I maintained eye contact with Catherine Hale throughout, watching for the moment of collapse, the crack in the mask, the instant when she would understand what was standing on the other side of this table. She listened to the entire thing without interrupting. When I finished, the chamber fell into the kind of silence that has texture, heavy and thick, like the air before a storm on a high-gravity world. Dreneth shifted his weight behind me, a barely perceptible movement that told me he was ready for whatever came next. The sentinels tightened their grips on their weapons. I placed the tablet on the table and folded my hands and waited for the fear to arrive in her eyes, for the trembling, for the desperate plea to renegotiate. Instead, Catherine reached into her leather bag and pulled out a newspaper. Not a datapad, not a holographic display, not a diplomatic counterproposal or a message from her government or a personal shield generator. A newspaper. Actual paper, printed with actual ink, folded in the way humans apparently fold their information sheets, with crisp creases and a masthead across the top in bold black letters. She opened it, leaned back in her chair, crossed one leg over the other, and began reading. I stared at her for a full 10 seconds, She did not look up. She turned a page with a small, crisp sound that seemed impossibly loud in the silent chamber. I said, "Ambassador Hale, I have just read you the formal terms of your species' surrender." She did not look up. "I heard you." "And your response?" She licked her fingertip and turned another page. "I am thinking about it." I glanced at Drenith. His face was unreadable, but I could see the confusion in his posture, in the way his weight had shifted forward slightly, as though he were leaning toward a problem he could not identify. He leaned toward my ear and whispered that this might be a psychological tactic, some kind of deliberate provocation designed to destabilize the proceedings. I considered the possibility. The Alari had attempted something similar once, refusing to speak for 6 hours in the hope that the silence would unsettle us. It had not worked, but at least it had been recognizable as a strategy. This was different. There was no tension in Catherine's shoulders, no careful performance in her posture, no sideways glances to gauge my reaction. She was not performing composure. She was not pretending to be calm. She was reading a newspaper because she wanted to read a newspaper, and the declaration of war against her species was, apparently, not interesting enough to interrupt that activity. I said, "Ambassador, I feel obligated to remind you that the full military force of the Varathi Empire stands behind this declaration. 12 warships are in orbit around this station at this very moment. Our second armada, the largest fleet ever assembled in the history of galactic civilization, is on standby and can be deployed within hours. You have 6 hours to respond formally to these terms. If you do not, the first bombardment will commence against your nearest colony. I want to be very clear about what that means. Your people will die. Your stations will burn. This is not a negotiation." Catherine looked up. She had calm brown eyes, the kind of eyes that belonged to someone who had slept well the night before and expected to sleep well tonight, and tomorrow night, and every night after that. There was no defiance in them, no anger, no bravado, no theatrical courage, just a steady, almost maternal patience that made me feel, for a disorienting instant, like a child who had just said something embarrassing at a dinner party. She folded the newspaper neatly, set it on the table beside her thermos, and said, "You can start whenever you want. But I would recommend reading the sports section first. There is a great piece on underdog victories." Then she unscrewed the cap of her thermos and poured herself a cup of coffee. The sound of liquid hitting ceramic was the loudest thing in the room. The smell hit me a moment later. Something warm and dark and unfamiliar. She held the cup in both hands, took a slow sip, and returned to her newspaper. I felt something cold move through my chest, and I did not understand what it was. It was not anger. Anger I knew. Anger was useful, productive, a tool that could be sharpened and aimed. This was not that. It was not frustration either. Frustration implied that things were not going according to plan, but could still be redirected. This feeling was deeper than that. Older, it lived in a part of me that existed before training, before rank, before the Empire taught me what to think and how to think it. I dismissed it. I was a senior diplomatic attaché of the Varathi Empire, and I did not have time for unnamed feelings. I turned to Drenith and issued the order. The first strike fleet was to move immediately on humanity's nearest colony, a research station called Achilles, located in a system the humans had settled roughly 80 years ago. 200 warships, fully armed, and crewed by veterans of 9 previous campaigns. The fleet was commanded by Admiral Soreth, a decorated officer who had personally overseen the bombardment of 4 homeworlds and the subjugation of 6 species. 200 ships against 1 station. It was, by any rational calculation, overwhelming force applied to an insignificant target. As I transmitted the order, I glanced back at Catherine. She was reading an article with what appeared to be genuine interest, her head tilted slightly to one side. She had not even looked up when I gave the command to attack her people. She had not flinched, had not tensed, had not done any of the things that a person does when they hear that violence is about to be inflicted on someone they care about. She just kept reading. Drenith walked me out of the chamber. In the corridor, a junior officer stopped me with a question that I have replayed in my mind every day since. He was young, barely old enough for his uniform, and his face had the open, unguarded quality of someone who had not yet learned to hide what he was feeling. He said, "Sir, Why is she not afraid? I told him it did not matter. I told him fear was irrelevant when the mathematics of power were this clear. I told him the humans were outnumbered, outgunned, and outmatched in every measurable dimension, and that their envoy's strange behavior was nothing more than the final denial of a doomed species grasping for dignity in the face of annihilation. I said these things with confidence and authority, and the young officer nodded and returned to his post looking reassured. But I did not believe my own words, and somewhere in the back of my mind, beneath the layers of imperial training and conditioned arrogance, a small voice was asking the same question the junior officer had asked. It kept asking it as I walked to the war room. It kept asking it as I sat down at my console and watched the First Strike Fleet's markers move across the tactical display toward Achilles Station. It kept asking it as the minutes ticked by and the fleet drew closer to what should have been an easy, forgettable victory. Why was she not afraid? The First Strike Fleet jumped to light speed within the hour. 200 warships moving in flawless formation, each one carrying enough firepower to crack a continent. I watched their departure from the war room aboard our command vessel, the Dominion's Wrath, and settled in to wait for the victory report. Standard procedure, standard timeline. We had done this so many times that the process had the mechanical predictability of a factory line. The fleet should have reached Achilles Station in 40 minutes. Another 20 minutes to eliminate all resistance, assuming there was any resistance to eliminate. Our intelligence indicated a population under 4,000, mostly researchers and support staff. No military garrison, no orbital defense grid, no weapons platforms. The entire operation was projected to last 90 minutes at most. 90 minutes passed, then 2 hours, then 3. No status report arrived, no confirmation of engagement, no tactical feed, no sensor data, no communication of any kind from any of the 200 ships. They had gone completely silent. Drenith ran diagnostics on our communication arrays. Everything was functioning on our end. The relay stations were online, the frequencies were clear, the encryption protocols were cycling normally. The problem was not with our equipment. The fleet simply was not responding. At the 3-hour mark, a single transmission broke through. It was audio only, fragmented and layered with static, so thick it sounded like the signal was being dragged through gravel. It came from Admiral Soreth himself, and his voice was not the voice of a man delivering a tactical update. It was the voice of a man who had just seen something that existed outside the boundaries of everything he had been trained to understand. He said 3 words before the transmission collapsed into noise and then into nothing. They are learning. I played those words back 17 times. Each repetition made the cold feeling in my chest grow thicker, heavier, more difficult to ignore. I ordered a full intelligence review of everything we had on Achilles Station. The reports were thin and contradictory. Achilles was classified as a civilian research outpost. Its primary function appeared to be something the humans called electromagnetic field theory, a discipline our analysts had flagged as low priority and academically obscure. The station had no strategic value that we could identify. 4 hours after the fleet jumped, the sensor data finally began arriving, not from the fleet. Our deep space observation arrays, which had been passively monitoring the Achilles system, started streaming information to the war room. Drenith processed it in silence. Then he took a step back from his console and looked at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before. He looked like a man who had just been told that the ground he was standing on was not ground at all. Of the 200 warships in the First Strike Fleet, 197 had been disabled. Not destroyed. Disabled. Their engines were offline. Their weapons systems were unresponsive. Their navigation arrays had been scrambled into patterns of meaningless noise. Their communication equipment had been selectively deactivated, leaving them capable of receiving signals but not transmitting them. The ships were structurally intact, their hulls undamaged, their crews alive and unharmed. But they were completely inert, drifting in the space around Achilles Station, like seeds scattered on the surface of still water. 3 ships had attempted to self-destruct near the station, their captains choosing annihilation over the humiliation of capture. The self-destruct sequences had been remotely cancelled. Our own ships had been denied permission to destroy themselves by something inside the human station, something that understood our self-destruct protocols well enough to override them in real time. 0 human casualties. 0. 200 warships neutralized, and the humans had not lost a single life. They had not even scratched the paint on our hulls. They had simply reached into the guts of our technology and turned everything off, the way you might flip a switch in a room you were leaving. I sat with that information for a very long time. The war room was quiet around me. The officers at their stations were staring at their screens without speaking. Someone had turned off the tactical display because none of us wanted to look at 200 motionless ship markers drifting in a cloud around a tiny station icon. I went back to the diplomatic chamber. Catherine was still there. She had moved on to a different section of the newspaper. Her thermos was half empty. A small plate sat beside it with crumbs on it, suggesting she had at some point eaten a snack. She looked up when I entered, and there was no triumph in her expression, no satisfaction, no gleaming awareness of what had just happened. She looked at me with the same mild, patient attention she had worn since the moment she first sat down. I asked her what had happened at Achilles Station. I asked her what kind of weapon could disable 200 warships simultaneously, without causing a single casualty. She took a sip of coffee, set the cup down with a gentle clink against the table, and said, "Weapon is a strong word. That is our graduate student's thesis project. Adaptive electromagnetic resonance mapping. They have been looking for something to test it on for months, so honestly, you did them a favor." She paused, as though considering whether to add something, and then said, "They will probably write a paper about your shield harmonics. Interesting frequency pattern, by the way. Very symmetrical. Our kids were impressed." Graduate students. A thesis project. She was telling me that 200 warships, crewed by veterans of 9 campaigns and commanded by an admiral whose name was spoken with reverence across 40 star systems, had been neutralized by the academic work of young humans who were not even part of their military. Young people working on a project for school had disarmed the most feared strike force in the galaxy and were now planning to write a paper about it. I searched her face for deception and found none. I searched it for mockery and found none of that either. She was stating facts the way someone might state the weather, matter of fact, unperformative. True. I reported the Achilles disaster to the Emperor through a secure channel. His response was immediate and exactly what I had feared. Escalation. The Second Armada, 2,000 warships, the largest and most powerful fleet ever assembled in the history of galactic civilization, was ordered to mobilize. Their destination was not a colony or an outpost. Their destination was Earth. The Emperor wanted the human homeworld reduced to glass and silence, a message so loud that no species in the galaxy would ever question Varathi supremacy again. I protested. I told the Emperor we did not understand what we were facing. I told him that a species capable of disabling 200 warships without firing a single shot was not a species we should be charging toward blindly. I told him about Catherine's calm, about the newspaper, about the graduate students. I told him that something about this situation felt fundamentally wrong, that the pattern did not match anything in our 400 years of conflict, and that charging forward without understanding was not strategy, but suicide. He called me a coward. He said the Second Armada had never been deployed without achieving total victory, and that its record would not be broken by a species that still printed information on wood pulp. He told me to deliver the escalation notification to the human envoy and to stop wasting his time with fear. I was overruled. In the hierarchy of the Varathi Empire, there was no appeal beyond the Emperor's word. His voice was law, his displeasure was exile, and his anger was the precursor to extinction. I had spent my career navigating the narrow corridor between obedience and conscience, and for most of that career, the corridor had been wide enough to walk through without scraping the walls. But now the walls were closing, and I was not sure there was a corridor left at all. I returned to my quarters and sat in the dark for a long time. I thought about Catherine Hale sitting in her chair with her newspaper. I thought about the graduate students on Achilles Station, who had turned off 200 warships like dimming a row of lamps. I thought about my daughter's blue flower blooming in the dark on a balcony 400 light-years away. And I thought about the fact that I was about to deliver a message announcing the mobilization of the most destructive fleet in galactic history against a species that had responded to our first act of war by writing a research paper about our technology. As I left the war room, I passed Catherine in the corridor. She was walking slowly, carrying her newspaper under one arm, heading back toward the guest quarters the station had provided for her. She stopped when she saw me. We stood there for a moment, separated by 3 meters of corridor and 400 years of imperial arrogance, and looked at each other. Then she said something that I have never forgotten, something I think about every morning when I wake up and every night before I sleep. She said, "You should call your family tonight, Atashi." I asked her why. She looked at me with something in her eyes that I could not name at the time. It was not pity exactly. It was closer to what you might feel when you watch someone walk toward a cliff edge and you know they cannot hear your warnings over the wind. A helplessness wrapped in kindness. She said, "Because tomorrow, your emperor is going to do something he cannot take back, and I want you to have said the things that matter before that happens." She walked away. Her footsteps were soft on the corridor floor, unhurried, ordinary. I stood there for a long time, watching the empty space where she had been. Then I went to the communication bay and did something I had not done in months. I called my daughter. Her name is Sarah. She was surprised to hear from me. Surprised and pleased and a little confused, the way children are when a parent who has been absent suddenly reaches out without explanation. We talked for an hour about things that had nothing to do with war or empires or declarations. She told me about her studies at the academy, about a new plant she was growing on the balcony of her apartment, something with blue flowers that only bloomed at night. She told me about a piece of music she was learning to play on the kithara, a traditional instrument that I had played badly as a young man, and had not touched in decades. I told her I loved her. She went quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was thick with emotion she was trying to hold back. It was the first time I had said those words to her in 20 years. 20 years of service to an empire that had taught me to value strength and discipline and conquest above all things, and I had forgotten to tell my own daughter that I loved her. When the call ended, I sat alone in the dark communication bay and wondered what Catherine Hale knew that I did not, and I wondered whether I would be grateful or terrified when I finally found out. The second armada launched at the beginning of the next cycle, 2,000 warships moving in perfect formation, their drives lighting up the sensor arrays of every station and outpost within 100 light-years. Any species watching from afar would have seen a river of light pouring through the dark, and they would have known what it meant. The Varathi Empire was going to war with its full strength, and whatever lay at the end of that river was about to be erased from the galaxy. Fleet Admiral Corveth commanded the armada from the bridge of the Hammer of Silence, the flagship of the fleet, and the largest warship ever constructed by any known civilization. It was a vessel built not just for war but for spectacle, designed to be the last thing a dying species saw before the light went out. Corveth himself was a veteran of 9 extinction campaigns, a strategist whose tactical doctrines were taught at every military academy in the Empire. His name was used by mothers on conquered worlds to frighten their children into obedience. He had personally overseen the glassing of 3 homeworlds and the systematic dismantling of 2 civilizations. He was, by every standard the Empire used to measure its people, the most dangerous being in our part of the galaxy. The Armada dropped out of light speed at the edge of humanity's solar system, a place the humans called Sol. What they found there was exactly what I had feared, and exactly what Corveth had predicted. Nothing. No defense fleet arranged in battle formation, no orbital weapons platforms, no minefield, no energy barriers, no gravitational traps, no sensor nets. The solar system stretched out before the Armada in perfect, ancient silence. Just planets orbiting a yellow star, the way they had been orbiting for billions of years. It was so quiet that the Armada's long-range sensors had difficulty confirming that this was actually a populated system. If it were not for the faint electromagnetic signatures of human settlements on the 3rd and 4th planets, there would have been no evidence that anything intelligent had ever been here. A single automated broadcast greeted them on all frequencies, transmitted simultaneously in every known galactic language. Corveth's communications officer played it across the bridge. The message was brief and delivered in a neutral, synthetic voice that carried no emotion whatsoever. "Welcome to Sol. Humanity recommends you do not proceed past the orbit of Neptune. This is not a threat, it is a courtesy." Corveth laughed. "I know this, because I reviewed his bridge recordings later, during the formal inquiry. His laugh was loud and genuine, and full of the confidence of a man who had spent his entire career on the winning side of history. He said something dismissive about automated messages and ordered the Armada forward. They passed Neptune. The broadcast repeated, identical in every way to the first transmission. They passed Uranus. The broadcast repeated again, but this time, a single phrase had been appended to the end. We asked nicely. Corveth noted the change in his log, but gave it no further attention. He had seen psychological warfare before, crude attempts to use words as a substitute for weapons. It had never worked against the Varathi, because the Varathi did not negotiate with words. They negotiated with mass and velocity, and the precise application of overwhelming destructive force. I want to be clear about something. I was not aboard the Armada. I was watching from Oreth 9, reviewing sensor feeds and communication transcripts in near real time. But I had spent enough years working alongside Corveth to know how his bridge operated, how his officers moved, how the silence between his orders carried as much meaning as the orders themselves. What I am describing is reconstructed from the official recordings, the bridge logs, the sensor archives, and the personal testimonies of the officers who were there. Every detail has been verified. None of it has been exaggerated. If anything, the recordings do not capture the full weight of what happened, because recordings cannot capture the way fear tastes in the back of your throat when reality stops behaving the way you were taught it should. By the time the Armada reached the orbital path of Saturn, the sensor officers had begun filing anomaly reports. The reports were tentative and uncertain, marked with the kind of qualifying language that junior officers use when they are not sure whether what they are seeing is real or whether reporting it will make them look foolish. The anomalies were subtle. Gravity fluctuations in regions where no mass should have existed. Light bending at angles that did not correspond to any known gravitational lens effect. Background radiation signatures that appeared and disappeared at irregular intervals, like something very large was breathing in the dark spaces between the planets. Corveth reviewed the reports and dismissed them. He had commanded enough campaigns to know that sensor officers in unfamiliar systems always found anomalies. The unknown felt dangerous, simply because it was unknown. He ordered the Armada to maintain speed and heading. At Jupiter, something changed. The automated broadcast stopped. Between one repetition and the next, it simply ceased, replaced by a silence so complete and so total that the communications officer flagged it as an active anomaly. This was not the natural silence of empty space. This was the deliberate suppression of all background electromagnetic noise in the area surrounding the Armada. The cosmic microwave background, the faint radio chatter of distant pulsars, the whisper of solar wind against magnetic fields, all of it gone. The Armada was moving through a pocket of absolute quiet, and the quiet felt intentional. One of Corveth's senior captains, a woman named Drea who had served under him for 15 years, approached him on the bridge. She was not a person given to nervousness. She had commanded the vanguard during the siege of the Keth homeworld, and had earned her rank through acts of tactical brilliance under extreme pressure. When she spoke, her voice was steady, but there was something beneath the steadiness that I recognized when I listened to the recordings. It was the sound of a person who trusted her instincts more than her instruments, and her instincts were screaming. She said, "Admiral, I have commanded warships for 30 years, and I have been in more combat engagements than I can count. I have never felt anything like this. Something is watching us. I do not know what it is, and I do not know where it is, but it is here, and it has been here since we crossed Neptune's orbit. I am requesting permission to deploy sensor drones in a wide dispersal pattern." Corveth told her to return to her station. He said, "We are the second armada of the Varathi Empire. Nothing in this galaxy watches us. We are the ones who watch." The armada crossed the asteroid belt, and that was when the humans finally responded. It did not come as an attack. There were no weapons fire, no missiles, no energy beams, no kinetic projectiles. It came as a demonstration. A section of the asteroid belt, roughly 40,000 individual rocks ranging in size from pebbles to small moons, began to move. Not randomly, not chaotically, not in the turbulent, gravitationally influenced way that asteroids normally drift. They moved with precision, mathematical, absolute, terrifying precision. The asteroids rearranged themselves into a formation that perfectly mirrored the Varathi Armada's attack configuration. Ship for ship, position for position, spacing for spacing. 2,000 rocks hanging in space in the exact same pattern as 2,000 warships, right down to the relative positions of the fighter wings and the distances between the carrier groups. It was a mirror image so perfect that the Armada's tactical computer initially classified it as a reflection error and attempted to filter it out of the display. The formation held for 3 seconds. 3 seconds during which every officer on every bridge in the Armada stared at their screens and understood, in a way that required no explanation and no analysis, what they were looking at. They were looking at something that could manipulate 40,000 physical objects simultaneously, with positional accuracy measured in centimeters, and arrange them into a pattern that demonstrated perfect, real-time knowledge of the Armada's exact formation. Then the asteroids dissolved back into their natural orbits. They scattered across the belt in random, lazy trajectories, tumbling and spinning as though nothing had happened, as though 40,000 rocks had not just performed a ballet of impossible precision and then shrugged and gone back to sleep. The bridge of the Hammer of Silence went silent. The recordings show no sound whatsoever for 47 seconds. 47 seconds of absolute quiet on the bridge of the most powerful warship in galactic history, broken only by the soft hum of the life support systems and the gentle beeping of sensor consoles that did not know they were supposed to be frightened. Then Corvith spoke, quietly, almost to himself. What was that? His science officer, a brilliant but chronically anxious man named Fenrath, answered in a voice that was barely above a whisper, "Sir, something just moved 40,000 asteroids simultaneously, with positional accuracy to within 1/10 of a meter, and returned them to their original orbital trajectories, without any detectable energy expenditure. No gravitational manipulation, no electromagnetic force, no tractor beams, no kinetic drivers. They just moved. I have no theoretical framework that can explain what we just observed." Drya spoke up again, and this time she did not ask for permission. "Admiral, they are telling us they can move the building blocks of a solar system like pieces on a game board. And they are doing it casually. This is still just a demonstration." Corvith sat in his command chair and did not speak for a long time. The recordings show him staring at the main viewport, watching the asteroid belt drift in its quiet, ancient orbit, as though nothing remarkable had just occurred. His hands were resting on the arms of the chair. They were perfectly still, but the tendons in his wrists were standing out like cables, and I know from personal experience that Corvith's hands only looked like that when he was using every ounce of his considerable willpower to keep them from shaking. When he finally spoke, he gave an order that no Varathi admiral had ever given in 400 years of interstellar warfare. He ordered a full retreat. 2,000 warships turned around without firing a single shot. The most powerful military force the galaxy had ever assembled reversed course and left human space in absolute silence, their drives lighting up the darkness as they fled from a species that had not even bothered to greet them in person. There was no engagement report, no tactical analysis, no formal summary of the encounter. In his personal log, Corvith wrote a single line that was later entered into the official record of the inquiry. It said, "They are not a civilization. They are a sleeping god that reads newspapers." When the Armada returned to Varathi space, the Emperor's response was volcanic. He stripped Corvith of his rank. He confined him to quarters aboard the Hammer of Silence under armed guard. He ordered every officer who had served on the Armada's bridge to submit to loyalty interrogation under neural scan. He declared publicly that the retreat was an act of treason, that the asteroid display was nothing more than an elaborate holographic illusion designed to frighten weak-minded officers into cowardice, and that humanity's apparent capabilities were a fiction maintained by a species that was bluffing with an empty hand. The imperial propaganda machine activated within the hour. State broadcasts across all Varathi territories declared that the Armada had achieved a strategic repositioning, not a retreat, that the human solar system had been successfully surveyed and its defenses catalogued, that the full weight of the Empire's response was being calculated and would be delivered at a time and manner of the Emperor's choosing. The broadcasts were polished, professional, and utterly disconnected from reality. I watched them from Oreth 9 and felt something I had not felt in decades of service. Shame, not for the retreat, for the lie. Drenith came to me after the third broadcast and asked me, quietly, whether I believed the official account. I told him no. He nodded, as though I had confirmed something he already knew, and then he said something that surprised me. He said, "Sir, I have served the Empire faithfully for 22 years. I have never questioned an order or doubted an official report, but I watched the sensor data from the asteroid belt, and I know what I saw. And I know that what the Emperor is telling our people is not what happened." He paused. "What do we do?" I did not have an answer for him. I did not have an answer for myself. But I had seen the sensor data. I had reviewed the gravitational readings from every deep space array within 100 light-years of Sol. I had spent hours with the science division analyzing the energy signatures, or rather the absence of energy signatures, that accompanied the asteroid demonstration. And I knew, with the kind of certainty that settles into your bones and refuses to leave, that what happened in the asteroid belt was not an illusion. Something in human space had the ability to manipulate matter on a scale that our civilization could not comprehend, could not replicate, and could not defend against. And it had used that ability not to attack us, not to destroy even a single ship, but to deliver a message so simple and so clear that even Corveth, the most aggressive military commander in our history, had understood it instantly. "Turn around. You are out of your depth." I went to find Catherine. She was in her quarters on Oreth 9, asleep in a chair with the newspaper draped over her face. The thermos sat on the table beside her, cap off, still faintly warm. Her shoes were on the floor beside the chair, and her feet were tucked beneath her. She looked like someone who had fallen asleep watching a slow movie. I sat down across from her and waited. The station hummed around us. Through the viewport behind her, I could see the stars, and for the first time in my career, they looked less like points of light and more like eyes. When she woke, she stretched and yawned and blinked at me with the drowsy confusion of someone who had forgotten where she was. Then her eyes focused, and her expression settled into the same calm, patient neutrality she had worn since the moment she arrived. She looked at her thermos, seemed disappointed that the coffee had cooled, and looked at me. I asked her the question that was eating me alive. "What are you?" She rubbed her eyes, considered the thermos again, and said, "Tired, mostly. Want some coffee?" I did not want coffee. I wanted answers. But Catherine Hale was not a woman who gave answers on anyone's schedule but her own, and I was beginning to understand that pushing her would get me nothing but more newspaper pages turned in polite silence. The Emperor's fury was not the kind that burned hot and faded. It was the kind that cooled and hardened and became something far more dangerous than anger. Within hours of the Second Armada's retreat, he convened the Imperial War Council in a closed session, from which even senior diplomatic staff were excluded. When the session ended, Drenith brought me a classified briefing that made my blood turn to ice in my veins. The Emperor had invoked the Silence Doctrine. I had heard the name before, in whispered references during classified briefings, in the occasional oblique mention buried in historical texts that had been redacted so heavily they read like fever dreams. The Silence Doctrine was not a strategy. It was not a battle plan. It was a single weapon, and the weapon had a name: the Silence Engine. The Silence Engine was a moon-sized device hidden in a system that the Emperor controlled personally, staffed by a crew that had been genetically modified to feel loyalty to nothing except the device itself. It had taken 3 centuries to build. 40 conquered worlds had contributed their resources, their minerals, their labor to its construction, and most of those worlds had been stripped bare in the process. Its function was singular and absolute. It collapsed stars, not destroyed them, collapsed them. It induced a cascading gravitational failure in a star's core, causing it to compress past its Chandrasekhar limit and implode into a singularity. The resulting black hole consumed everything in the system: planets, moons, stations, ships, debris, light itself. Everything pulled inward toward a point of infinite density, leaving behind nothing but a wound in space-time where a solar system used to exist. It had been used once, against a species so old and so advanced that their technology had begun to approach something the Varathi could not control. The weapon erased them so completely that no record of their name survives. Their homeworld, their colonies, their history, their art, their language, their biology, every trace of their existence was pulled into the dark and crushed into nothing. They are the galaxy's only true ghost, a species that was not merely killed but unmade, removed from the record of existence as thoroughly as if they had never been. The Emperor ordered the silence engine aimed at Sol, at humanity's sun, at the star that warmed the world, where Catherine Hale had learned to read newspapers, and drink coffee, and smile at people who threatened to destroy everything she loved. I was given the task of delivering the formal notification. I found Catherine in the diplomatic chamber, sitting in the same chair she had occupied since the first day, reading her newspaper. The thermos was nearly empty. She looked up when I entered, and for the first time, she greeted me by name. "Ven," she said, "you look terrible." I read the notification aloud. I kept my voice steady through sheer force of training, the same training that had carried me through 11 previous declarations without a tremor. But this time, the words tasted different in my mouth. I told her that the silence engine had been activated, that Sol would be collapsed within 12 hours, and that there was no force in the known galaxy capable of preventing it. I told her this was not a negotiation, not a threat, not a final warning. This was an extinction notice. I told her that after the engine fired, there would be no Earth, no Sol, no record, no evidence, no memory that humanity had ever walked beneath a yellow sun. I told her that the Emperor had ordered her species unmade. As I spoke, I became aware of a feeling I had never experienced during any previous declaration. I did not want to be saying these words. I did not want to be the instrument through which this sentence was delivered. For the first time in my career, I was not a diplomat performing his function. I was a person standing in front of another person and telling her that everything she had ever loved was about to be erased, and it felt wrong in a way that went beyond politics or strategy or duty. It felt wrong in my chest, in my stomach, in the places where emotions live before the mind has time to name them. For the first time since I had met her, Catherine's expression changed. The shift was small. If I had not been watching her face with the desperate intensity of a man searching for answers, I might have missed it. A tightening around the eyes, a stillness that settled over her body like frost forming on a pane of glass. The last trace of casual amusement drained from her features, and what remained was something harder and quieter and infinitely more focused. She set down her coffee cup. She folded the newspaper with careful, deliberate hands, each crease pressed flat with her fingertips. She placed it on the table. She stood. And the air in the room changed. I do not know how to describe this in a way that makes rational sense. The temperature did not shift. The pressure did not change. The lights did not flicker. But something fundamental about the quality of the space around us was suddenly and profoundly different. It felt as though something vast and ancient and patient had just turned its attention to this exact point in space and time. It felt like standing in a field and sensing, without seeing or hearing, that something enormous had just opened its eyes directly behind you. Drenneth felt it too. I saw him take a half step backward, his hand moving instinctively toward the sidearm he was not carrying. Catherine asked me for a communication channel to Earth. Her voice was calm, controlled. The steadiness of it was more frightening than any display of anger or panic would have been. I granted the channel. Part of me, the part that was still a loyal servant of the Empire, wanted to hear what humanity sounded like when it faced true extinction. I expected begging. I expected the sound of a species coming apart at the seams. Instead, Catherine spoke calmly to someone she addressed only as director. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes. She said, "They are pointing the Starkiller at Sol. Yes, I know. No, I gave them the warnings. All of them." There was a pause, long enough for the person on the other end to respond. Catherine closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, something had settled behind her gaze, something that reminded me of Corvith's description, something godlike. She said, "All right, I will tell them." She closed the channel and turned to face me. The look in her eyes was something I had never seen on any face, human or otherwise. It was not anger. It was not determination. It was a terrible, quiet sadness, the kind that comes not from fear of what might happen, but from certainty about what will happen, and grief that it must. She said, And I will remember every word of this until the last cell in my body stops functioning. Attaché Solari. I want you to understand something. Everything you have seen so far, Achilles Station, the asteroid belt, the demonstrations, that was not our military. That was not even our government. That was our universities. Our curious kids with too much funding and not enough supervision. She paused. The silence between her sentences had weight and texture. You are now going to see what happens when you threaten our son, and I am sorry. I genuinely am. Before I could respond, before I could even process the implications of what she had just said, the lights on the station dimmed, not from a power failure, from something pulling energy from the fabric of space itself, drawing it inward from every direction simultaneously, like the universe taking a breath before a scream. In the space of 4 minutes, 3 things happened simultaneously across the galaxy. First, every Varathi military communication network went silent. Not jammed, not disrupted, not interfered with, erased. Our encryption protocols, our relay stations, our subspace frequencies, our emergency backups, all of them ceased to exist, not malfunctioned, ceased to exist. As though someone had reached into the fundamental architecture of electromagnetic physics and simply removed the frequencies we used, the way you might pull a single thread from a tapestry. 2,000 warships, 40 military installations, 16 planetary defense grids, and the entire Imperial command structure lost the ability to communicate with each other in the time it takes to draw a single breath. Second, the silence engine began to disassemble itself. The crew aboard the engine reported, through the one channel that still functioned, which I would later realize the humans had deliberately left open, that the device was coming apart. Not exploding, not failing, being taken apart at the molecular level by forces that were invisible and impossibly precise. Components that had been welded together by stellar-grade fusion torches were separating along their molecular bonds, peeling away from each other like layers of an onion, each piece drifting gently away in perfect, orderly sequence. The power core, a controlled singularity that had taken 60 years to stabilize, was being carefully, delicately unwound. Its energy dispersed in measured increments that caused no damage to anything around it. Whatever was dismantling the engine understood its construction down to the subatomic level and was taking it apart with the care of a surgeon removing a tumor from a living brain. Third, a human fleet appeared. Not through lightspeed, not through jump gates, not through wormholes or dimensional rifts, or any form of transit that our sensors could detect or our physics could explain. The ships were simply there, as though they had always occupied that exact volume of space and had only now chosen to become visible. 47 vessels, each one smaller than a Varathi frigate, arranged in a perfect sphere around the Dominion's wrath, their hulls gleaming with a light that seemed to come from inside the metal itself. Our sensors told us what those ships were radiating. Each one was producing more energy than our home star. 47 ships, each with the output of a sun, arranged in a sphere around our flagship. The readings were so far beyond anything in our threat classification system that the computer flagged them as sensor malfunctions and attempted to recalibrate. It recalibrated 7 times. The numbers did not change. I fell to my knees. Not from an attack, not from a weapon, not from any physical force applied to my body. I fell because I understood. In that moment, standing in the diplomatic chamber on Orith 9, watching 47 impossible ships burn with the light of 47 stolen suns, I understood what Catherine Hale had been trying to tell us since the moment she sat down and opened her newspaper. The humans had never been hiding their strength. They had been restraining it. Every step of this conflict, every interaction, every cup of coffee, and every turned page, and every polite warning, it was all mercy. They had been holding back the way a parent holds back when a toddler swings a small fist at their knee. Patiently, gently, giving the child every possible opportunity to stop before anyone gets hurt. The Varathi Empire, with its 400 years of conquest, and its silence engine, and its legacy of terror and subjugation, was not a threat to humanity. We were not even an inconvenience. We were a minor disruption in the schedule of a species that had better things to do with its afternoon. Catherine knelt beside me. I had not heard her move. She placed a hand on my shoulder, and her grip was steady and warm, and impossibly human. She said, "I need you to contact your emperor, right now. Because what happens next is either a conversation or a funeral, and I would very much like it to be a conversation." I looked up at her. She had picked up the newspaper from the table, but she was not reading it. She was holding it against her chest, pressed flat over her heart, the way someone might hold a photograph of their family during a storm. Something human, something ordinary, something to anchor herself to in a moment that had gone far beyond anything ordinary. My hands were shaking so badly that Dreneth had to help me operate the communication console. The Emperor's personal channel was the only one still functioning in the entire Varathi military network. I realized, with a clarity that cut like a blade, that this was intentional. The humans had shut down everything else and left this single channel open. They wanted me to make this call. They were giving us one last chance. The Emperor's face appeared on the screen. He looked diminished. The ceremonial robes he wore seemed too large for his frame, and the golden light of the imperial throne room behind him looked cheap and thin compared to the light pouring through our viewport from the human ships. His eyes moved past me to the glow behind me, and I watched the color drain from his face. For the first time in my decades of service, I saw fear on the face of the man who had made fear his instrument of governance. It did not look the way I expected. It did not look like weakness. It looked like a man waking up from a dream and realizing that the world he thought he lived in had never existed. I told him what had happened. The communication blackout across the entire military network. The silence engine being taken apart by invisible hands with surgical precision. The fleet that had appeared from empty space radiating the energy output of 47 suns. The fact that our most destructive weapon, the one we had built to kill gods, had been disassembled the way a watchmaker takes apart a broken timepiece. I told him all of it, and my voice cracked twice, and I did not care. I had spent my entire career being composed and professional and dignified, and none of those things meant anything anymore. Dignity is a luxury afforded to people who still believe they understand the rules. The rules had just been rewritten by a species that read newspapers during declarations of war. Catherine stepped into the frame behind me. She said, loud enough for the Emperor to hear, 1 hour. You have 1 hour to agree to a formal ceasefire and enter negotiations. After that, the decision is out of my hands." The Emperor stared at her, then at the light behind her. Then the connection went dark. The hour passed in silence. Catherine sat in her chair. She did not read the newspaper. She held it in her lap and stared at the viewport, watching the human ships hover in their perfect formation, their light turning the blackness of space into something that looked almost warm. Almost like dawn on a world that still had a sun. I sat across from her and tried to remember how to breathe. When the hour ended, Catherine stood. She looked at me, and the sadness in her eyes was so deep it felt like something I could fall into. Then the 47 human ships broadcast. Every screen in the Varathi Empire lit up simultaneously. Every communication device, every personal display, every public monitor, every data terminal, on every world the Empire controlled. The broadcast was not a weapon. It was not an ultimatum. It was information. A complete, real-time, interactive map of every Varathi military asset in the galaxy. Every warship, every base, every hidden weapons depot, every classified research facility, every covert listening post, every supply line, every emergency bunker, every escape route the Emperor had ever prepared for himself. Coordinates, crew rosters, structural schematics, power core specifications, shield frequencies, weapons loadouts, command codes, everything. Sent to every citizen of the Empire simultaneously. The humans did not fire a single shot. They did not destroy a single ship or damage a single station or harm a single Varathi life. They simply showed our people the truth. They showed them that every secret their government had ever kept, every hidden weapon their emperor had ever used to maintain his grip on power, was known, catalogued, understood, and utterly meaningless against the species he had chosen to threaten. They showed the people of the Varathi Empire that their emperor's power was a glass wall, and that humanity could shatter it with a thought, and they let the people decide what to do with that information. The emperor surrendered within 90 minutes. Not to the humans, to his own people. The riots began on the homeworld within 30 minutes of the broadcast. Provincial governors began declaring independence within the hour. The Imperial Guard laid down their weapons by the second hour, most of them walking away from their posts and going home to their families without a word. The Emperor's formal capitulation was transmitted from the throne room by an aide, because the Emperor himself had locked himself in his private quarters and refused to come out. 400 years of dominion ended not with a battle, but with a broadcast. The peace terms arrived on a single sheet of paper. Catherine wrote them by hand, using a pen she produced from her jacket pocket, and a sheet torn from the back of her newspaper. Her handwriting was neat and small, and slightly slanted to the right. The terms were 4 sentences long. Stop conquering. Free the species you have enslaved. Ask before you take. Call us if you need help. I read those 4 sentences 100 times in the days that followed. I held the paper up to the light. I examined it under magnification. I ran linguistic analysis on the word choices, searching for coded meaning, for diplomatic subtleties, for the hidden clause that would reveal humanity's true demands. There was no hidden clause. There was no coded meaning. The humans wanted nothing from us except that we stop hurting people. The war lasted 6 days. In those 6 days, not a single human weapon was fired. Not a single Varathi citizen was killed by human hands. Not a single planet was burned. Not a single city was leveled. Not a single child was orphaned by human violence. The most powerful empire in galactic history was brought to its knees by a species that fought its war with patience, information, and a woman who read a newspaper while the galaxy held its breath. In the weeks that followed, the freed species began to emerge from their subjugation, like creatures stepping into sunlight after centuries underground. The Keth, who had been used as laborers in our mining operations for 300 years, sent a delegation to Earth to thank the humans personally. The delegation consisted of 12 elders who had never in their lives spoken to any species without first kneeling. When they arrived on Earth, a human woman at the spaceport greeted them by offering them tea and asking about their journey. The eldest of the Keth elders later told me that in that single moment, the simple act of being offered a hot drink by a stranger who expected nothing in return, he understood more about humanity than all the intelligence reports in the galaxy could have taught him. The Alari rebuilt their government in 40 days. The species the silence engine had erased could not be brought back, but the humans established a memorial commission to reconstruct what fragments of their culture might still exist in the records of other civilizations. It was, the Catherine told me, the least they could do, the least. As though preventing the extinction of a galactic empire and liberating a dozen enslaved species was a small thing, a preliminary gesture before the real work began. I am writing this account from my desk on a human space station called Meridian, orbiting a planet the humans call Mars. It has been 9 months since Catherine Hale sat across from me in that diplomatic chamber and opened her newspaper. 9 months since my understanding of the universe was taken apart as thoroughly and as carefully as the silence engine. I am no longer senior diplomatic attaché of the Varathi Empire. The Varathi Empire no longer exists. In its place, there is a loose federation of independent worlds, each governing itself, each finding its own way forward for the first time in centuries. The enslaved species are free. The war fleets have been decommissioned. The tribute payments have stopped. My title now is Ambassador. I am the first Varathi ambassador to Earth. It is a title I did not earn and do not deserve, but Catherine recommended me for it, and no one in the new Federation was inclined to argue with her. The first time I visited Earth, I went prepared for anything. I had studied every piece of data we had on the human homeworld. I had reviewed the sensor logs from the Armada's retreat. I had read Corveth's reports and Fenrath's analysis, and the classified briefings that had been released to the public after the Emperor's fall. I expected to find a fortress world. I expected gleaming towers of impossible technology, vast research complexes radiating the kind of energy that our ships had detected, military installations hidden beneath every mountain and ocean. I expected a planet that looked like what it was, the home of a species that could move stars and unmake empires and appear from empty space like ghosts. What I found was rain. It was raining when my shuttle landed at a port the humans call Heathrow, in a city called London, on an island the humans call Britain. The rain was soft and gray and smelled like soil, and something green that I later learned was called grass. A young man named Philip met me at the landing pad with an umbrella and a smile that showed too many teeth, which I have since learned is how humans express welcome rather than aggression. He walked me to a ground transport vehicle that moved at a speed I could have outpaced on foot, apologizing the entire time for something called traffic. We drove through streets lined with buildings that were old in the way humans count old, not the deep geological time that the Varathi measure by, but old enough to carry the weight of stories. I saw shops selling bread and flowers. I saw a woman walking a small furry animal on a leash, talking to it as though it could understand her. I saw children in bright-colored coats splashing in puddles, shrieking with laughter when the water sprayed up around their boots. I saw an elderly man sitting alone on a bench in a park, feeding birds from a paper bag, his face turned up to the rain as though it were a blessing he had been waiting for. This was the species that had disassembled the silence engine with invisible hands. This was the species that could move 40,000 asteroids like pieces on a game board. This was the species whose graduate students had neutralized 200 warships as a homework assignment. This was the species that had ended 400 years of galactic tyranny without spilling a single drop of blood, Varathi or human. And they were feeding birds in the rain, and splashing in puddles, and selling bread. I met Catherine at a small shop in London that served coffee and pastries. She looked different outside the context of Oreth 9. Smaller, somehow. More ordinary, if that word can be applied to a woman who had faced down the extinction of her species with a newspaper and a thermos. She was wearing a green coat and carrying a different newspaper, and when she saw me, she smiled the way you smile at someone you have survived a catastrophe with. Not joy exactly, something deeper and more complicated and more honest than joy. We sat by a window and watched the rain streak down the glass. The shop smelled like roasted coffee and baked sugar, and the sound system was playing soft music that I did not recognize but that made me feel, inexplicably, like I was somewhere I had been before. I asked her the question that had been consuming me since the day the Armada retreated. The question I had turned over in my mind during sleepless nights on Oreth 9, and quiet afternoons on Meridian, and the long shuttle ride down through Earth's atmosphere. I said, "How can you be so powerful and so ordinary at the same time?" She stirred her coffee with a small metal spoon and looked out the window. Across the street, a woman was struggling to lift a wheeled contraption called a stroller up over a curb, and a stranger stopped to help her without being asked. Catherine watched this happen with an expression of quiet contentment, as though it confirmed a hypothesis she had been testing her entire life. She said, "That is the secret, Ven. We are not powerful because we built weapons. We are powerful because we kept building everything else too. The weapons are a side effect of curiosity. The newspaper is the point." I did not fully understand her then. I think I am beginning to understand her now, 9 months later, sitting at this desk, writing these words. In my first week on Earth, I was assigned a human liaison named George Bennett, a retired diplomat who had spent 30 years negotiating trade agreements between human colony worlds. He was a tall man with gray hair and a quiet voice, and an apparently infinite capacity for patience, which he needed, because I asked him approximately 400 questions per day. He never once seemed annoyed. He answered each question with the same thoughtful attention, whether I was asking about the structure of their government or why the birds outside my window sang at precisely the same time every morning. One afternoon, George took me to a park in London where humans gather to do nothing. They sit on benches. They walk along paths. They throw flat discs to each other across the grass. They lie on blankets and stare at the sky. I watched them for 2 hours, trying to identify the strategic purpose of this activity, and George finally said, with the gentle amusement of someone explaining something obvious to a very intelligent person who was missing the point entirely, "Ven, they are not doing anything. That is the purpose. Rest is the purpose." I thought about that for a long time. The Varathi do not have a word for leisure that is not also a word for weakness. George also took me to a hospital. Not a military hospital or a research facility, but a place where ordinary humans go when they are sick or injured. I watched doctors and nurses move through corridors with urgent but unhurried efficiency, treating every patient as though that patient were the only person in the building. I watched a surgeon spend 4 hours repairing the damaged heart of an elderly man who, by Varathi standards of resource allocation, would have been considered too old and too unproductive to justify the expense. When I asked George why they would invest so much effort in saving one old man, he looked at me with genuine confusion and said, "Because he is a person." That answer stopped me in my tracks, not because it was profound, because it was so simple. Because it should have been obvious, and because in 400 years of empire, the Varathi had built a civilization where it was not obvious at all. In the months since my arrival, I have traveled across much of the human homeworld. I have visited their universities, where young people study problems that have no practical application and no military value, simply because the problems are interesting. I have watched a physicist spend 3 weeks trying to understand why a particular subatomic particle wobbles in a way that no existing model predicts, not because the answer would lead to a weapon or a tool, but because the wobble bothered her, and she wanted to know why. I have watched an engineer redesign a bridge, not because the old bridge was failing, but because he believed the new design would be more beautiful when the sunlight hit it at a certain angle in the afternoon. I have watched their children build towers out of colored blocks, and then knock them down and build them again, laughing each time the towers fell, learning each time they rebuilt. And I have realized that this is the fundamental engine of their species. Build, destroy, learn, build again, repeat, forever. They do it with blocks, and they do it with physics, and they do it with the fabric of space-time itself, and they do all of it with the same wide-eyed, insatiable, irrepressible need to find out what happens next. I have eaten their food, combinations of flavors and textures that seem contradictory until they reach your tongue, and then suddenly, impossibly, they work. I have listened to their music, which operates on emotional frequencies that my species does not possess words for. I have watched them argue about trivial things with the same passionate intensity they bring to the fundamental questions of existence, about which sports team is objectively superior, about the correct amount of spice in a particular dish, about whether a fictional character in a story made the right decision. I have watched a room full of humans spend 2 hours debating the philosophical implications of a children's animated film, and I have understood, finally and completely, that a species capable of arguing about cartoons with the same energy they bring to rearranging asteroid fields is a species that will never be defeated, not by us, not by anyone. Because they care about everything. That is their weapon, and that is their shield, and that is the thing that makes them different from every other civilization the galaxy has ever produced. They care about the small things and the enormous things with the same ferocity, the same attention, the same love, and that caring is what drives them. Not fear, not ambition, not the cold calculus of power and survival that has motivated every empire the Varathi have ever encountered or been. Love. Simple, stubborn, irrational, magnificent love for the act of being alive, and the privilege of sharing a universe with things they have not yet understood. An empire that conquers because it fears what it cannot control will always, eventually, meet something it cannot conquer. But a species that explores because it loves what it does not yet understand has no upper limit. There is no ceiling on curiosity. There is no wall at the end of wonder. There is only the next question, and the next, and the next, stretching out to the edge of infinity, and then beyond it, because a human would look at the edge of infinity and ask, what is on the other side? And then go find out. Admiral Korveth, who was stripped of his rank for retreating from the asteroid belt, has been reinstated by the new Varathi Federation. He serves now as the military liaison to a human outreach program that is helping former Varathi subject species rebuild their independent civilizations. I have spoken with him several times since his reinstatement. He is a changed man, quieter than the admiral I knew, more thoughtful, slower to speak, and quicker to listen. The first time he visited Earth, he went to a museum called the Natural History Museum in the city of London, and he stood in front of the reconstructed skeleton of a creature called Tyrannosaurus Rex for 45 minutes without speaking. When he finally spoke, he said, they kept the bones of their ancient predators and put them in a building where their children could come and stare at them and ask questions about them. This is the most extraordinary species in the galaxy. He told me something else, weeks later, that I have thought about every day since. He said, Then, when I gave the order to retreat, I was not afraid of what their weapons could do to my fleet. I was afraid because I realized that a species capable of moving asteroids with a thought had chosen, deliberately and consistently, not to harm us. That kind of restraint requires more strength than any weapon I have ever seen. I retreated because I understood that I was not facing an enemy. I was facing something that wanted to be a friend and was running out of ways to tell us so. My daughter, Sarah, visited me on Meridian last month. She brought the blue night-blooming flower from her balcony, replanted in a small pot, and set it on my desk beside the newspaper. She told me she had enrolled in a human university. She is studying something called marine biology, which is the science of living things that exist in the liquid water that covers most of Earth's surface. She showed me photographs of creatures from the deep ocean, things with transparent bodies and bioluminescent organs and tentacles that moved like slow-motion lightning. She was fascinated by them in the same way the human physicist was fascinated by the wobbling particle, not because they were useful, because they were there, and they were strange, and she wanted to understand them. She is becoming more human every day. I mean that as the highest compliment I know how to give. Last week, she sent me a message that said she had found a creature in the deep ocean that no human scientist had ever documented before. A tiny translucent thing with 6 hearts and bioluminescent markings that pulsed in patterns resembling mathematical sequences. She was ecstatic. She wrote 3 pages about it and ended with a single question. Why does it glow, Father? She asked it the way Catherine Hale might have asked it, not because the answer would be useful, because the question was beautiful. There is a newspaper on my desk. Catherine left it for me on the day she departed Meridian to return to Earth. She placed it in the center of my desk, with no note, no explanation, no ceremonial significance. Just a folded newspaper, sitting where a weapon schematic or an intelligence briefing would normally sit. I kept it there for months without opening it. I treated it like a sacred object, an artifact from a pivotal moment in galactic history. I believed it contained something important, some coded message, some final piece of wisdom that would complete my understanding of what had happened and why. Last night, I finally opened it. The headline on the front page said, "Local dog rescued from storm drain after 3-day ordeal, reunited with family." Below the headline was a photograph of a small brown dog with wet fur and bright eyes, being held by a girl who could not have been older than 8 or 9. The girl was crying. The dog was licking her face. Below the photograph, there were sports scores from something called the Premier League, a weather forecast predicting more rain, a recipe for lemon cake that called for the zest of 2 lemons, and an opinion column discussing whether public parks should have more benches for elderly residents. On the back page, there was a small advertisement for a local hardware shop, a crossword puzzle that was half completed in pencil, and a letter to the editor from a retired teacher who believed that the town library should extend its weekend hours so that children from working families could have more time to read. I stared at that newspaper for a very long time, and then I understood, not with my mind, which had been trying and failing to understand for 9 months, with something deeper. Something that existed in the part of me that had called my daughter and told her I loved her on the night before the second armada launched. The part that had listened to Catherine Hale when she told me to call my family. The part that had knelt on the floor of a diplomatic chamber and understood, for the first time in my life, that everything I had been taught about power and strength and civilization was wrong. I have spent my entire career studying the weapons of civilizations. I have cataloged extinction-level technologies and planet-killing machines and instruments of absolute annihilation. I have measured power in megatons and fleet sizes and the number of species a civilization has crushed beneath its heel. I have believed, for most of my adult life, that the measure of a civilization is its capacity for destruction. I was wrong. The measure of a civilization is what it chooses to care about when it has the power to care about anything. The measure of a species is not what it can destroy, but what it refuses to stop building, what it refuses to stop loving, what it refuses to stop noticing, even when the sky is falling and the universe is burning, and an empire with 400 years of conquest behind it is pointing a star-killing weapon at its sun. On the day the Varathi Empire declared war on 8 billion human beings, The thing those people cared about most was a dog stuck in a storm drain. Not the war, not the empire, not the fleet that was coming to destroy them. A dog. A small, scared, wet animal trapped underground in the dark, and the people who would not stop digging until they brought it home. That is humanity. That is why they moved the asteroids and took apart the silence engine and appeared from empty space like gods stepping out from behind a curtain, not because they wanted power, because they loved the dog, because they loved the girl who was crying for the dog, because they loved the lemon cake recipe, and the park benches, and the library hours, and the crossword puzzle, and the rain on the old man's face, and the strangers who help mothers with strollers, and the children who splash in puddles. Because they loved all of it, every ordinary, trivial, magnificent piece of being alive, and they would move every star in the galaxy before they let anyone take it away from them. That is why they will outlast every empire this galaxy has ever produced, or ever will produce. And that is why I keep this newspaper on my desk, not as a relic, not as a trophy, not as a symbol of victory or defeat, or the fall of an empire, as a reminder that sits beside my daughter's blue flower and catches the light from the viewport every morning when the station rotates to face the sun. A reminder that the measure of a species is not the size of its weapons, but the size of the things it refuses to stop caring about, even when the universe itself is burning around them. The dog's name, according to the article, was Charlie. He made a full recovery.